Caleb Mercer was 38 years old when four men he had never seen before walked into his own house and told him to leave it. For 11 years, Caleb had been the kind of man whose stillness made other men uncomfortable without their knowing why. He drove a 2014 F-250 with a cracked side mirror and a toolbox welded to the bed. He coached youth wrestling on Tuesday evenings at the Yimka in Fayetteville. He fixed things that were broken in the neighborhood when people asked, and sometimes when they didn't. What he did not do in 11 years of marriage was tell Adrienne the full story of the 8 years he had spent before she met him, because those years had required a clearance level that made casual conversation about them a technical violation, and because Raymond Caleb Mercer had never been a man who told stories about himself. While he was quiet, Adrienne planned. Over 9 months, she moved $67,000 from the joint account in increments that she timed around his payroll deposits, each transfer small enough to feel like noise in the numbers. She had told Marcus Webb, the man she had been seeing since February, a commercial contractor who drove a lifted Ram 1500 and spoke with the volume of a man who had never once doubted he was the largest thing in a room, that Raymond was soft, that he would fold, that once she told him it was over, he would take what she offered and go quietly, because that was what men like him did. She had arranged for Marcus to arrive at the house on a Saturday morning with 4 of his employees to help persuade the process along. She had no idea that the man those 4 employees were walking toward had spent 8 years as an 18 Delta Special Forces medical sergeant, with 2 combat deployments, 3 years in a direct action unit, and a set of skills that the United States Army had spent considerable money and time developing, and that Caleb had spent the 11 years since doing absolutely nothing to lose. She had no idea that he had clocked all 4 men through the living room window before any of them reached the front step, assessed each one in under 3 seconds, and had already decided, with the particular calm of someone for whom threat assessment is as automatic as breathing, exactly what he was going to do, and precisely what he was not going to need to. What Marcus Webb brought to Caleb Mercer's front door on a Saturday morning in October was not leverage. It was the worst decision of his life, made in full confidence in front of a witness who would later testify to every word. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5 a.m. Caleb was already awake. He had been awake since 4:40, which was when his body brought him up regardless of circumstance, regardless of what day it was, or what the night before had held. 8 years of fieldwork had installed this in him, the way rebar is installed in concrete. Not a habit exactly, more a structural condition. Something that was now load-bearing whether he intended it or not. He lay in the dark for 20 minutes with his eyes open and his breathing even, and his mind running its standard morning inventory, position, status, environment, threat. The bedroom was dark. Adrienne was on her side, facing the window. The house was quiet. Status, nominal. He got up without waking her. He moved through the house in the dark the way he moved through everything, deliberately, without noise, without wasted motion. He had learned, in places and under conditions he did not discuss, that the difference between a man who moves with purpose and a man who moves with noise is not strength or speed. It is the decision, made once and held, to do only what is necessary. He had made that decision a long time ago. Coffee first. The kitchen was a room he had rebuilt almost entirely himself 3 years back. Reclaimed white oak flooring he had cut and laid over a weekend in October. Open shelving he had built from poplar and finished with a hand-rubbed oil. The kind of patient craftsmanship that does not announce itself, but that people notice and cannot immediately explain. He filled the French press, set the kettle, and stood at the kitchen window while the water heated. The backyard in the early dark was still. A white oak at the fence line, one he had watched grow taller every year since they moved in, stood in its patient way against the gray pre-dawn sky. He looked at it for a moment. He poured the water over the grounds and let it steep for 4 minutes. He had developed specific opinions about coffee over years of consuming it in conditions where specificity was not an option, and had found that the return to conditions where it was felt like something worth honoring. He filled a thermos, pulled on a canvas work jacket he had owned for 6 years, and went out to the truck. The F-250 started on the first turn. It always started on the first turn. He drove through the quiet streets of the Fayetteville neighborhood he had lived in for 7 years, past the houses of people who were not yet awake, past the Emka 2 blocks over whose parking lot held 3 cars at this hour, early arrivals, people with their own reasons for being somewhere before the day required them. He noted the cars without slowing. He noted everything. He had not been able to stop noticing things since his second deployment, and had decided, at some point after he came home, that this was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived with honestly. He drove to the hardware store on Yadkin Road that opened at 6 for contractors. He needed 2x6s. He was building a covered section along the west fence of the backyard, a project he had planned through the summer and started framing the previous weekend. He knew what he needed before he walked in: the count, the grade, the cut list already in his field notebook in the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled 6 boards from the rack, checked each one for crown and warp without being asked to, loaded them in the bed, and paid in cash at the register. He was back in the truck by 6:20. The man at the register, a veteran named Pete, who had been working that counter for 15 years and could read military bearing the way some men read lumber, said every time Caleb came in, "Morning." Nothing else, and Caleb said, "Morning." And they conducted their entire relationship in those 2 syllables, with the understanding of men for whom this is sufficient. He drove home. He had been home for 4 years before Fayetteville. A year in a VA transition program he had entered not because he was broken, but because he understood, with the precision he applied to everything, that moving from 8 years of sustained high-stress operational work to civilian life without a structured transition was a bad plan. And he did not make bad plans when he could help it. He had used the year to finish the project management certification he had started before his final deployment. He had taken work with a construction firm in Raleigh for 2 years, doing exactly what he was certified to do, and learning the civilian industry's particular rhythms and inefficiencies with the patience of a man who had operated in considerably worse conditions. In the 3rd year, he started his own operation, Mercer Build LLC, residential and light commercial. 4 employees, a reputation in the neighborhood for doing work that lasted. He had built the company the way he built everything, from the structure out. Foundation first, no part of it announced before it was ready to carry weight. He had met Adrienne in Fayetteville at a friend's barbecue in the 2nd summer after he separated. She was quick and warm, sharp in the way of people who pay attention, and she had looked at him with the particular quality of attention that is not performed. She asked what he had done in the Army. He said, "Medical." She said, "Just medical?" He said, "Mostly." She had smiled at that, as if she understood there was more, and had decided not to press it, which was a quality he had found in very few people and had valued in her considerably. He had loved her without condition. He had built their house into a place of specific order and warmth. The way he built everything, from the reclaimed floors to the rebuilt kitchen to the covered porch he was adding now, piece by piece, each improvement a form of care that he did not make speeches about. He had believed, for most of their 11 years, that she received it as what it was. The signs had not been invisible. He had simply assessed them as he always assessed things, without reaching a conclusion before the evidence warranted one. Adrienne had begun coming home later in February, not dramatically later, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, with explanations that were complete and well-constructed and slightly over-detailed in the way that explanations become when they are covering something rather than conveying it. He noted this. He filed it. He did not conclude. In March, she mentioned a contractor named Marcus Webb who was submitting a competing bid on a commercial project her firm was managing. She mentioned him once, mid-dinner, as background information. She had not mentioned him again for 6 weeks, which in Caleb's experience was a longer gap than background information typically requires. He noted the gap. He did not conclude. In April, her phone began going face down on the nightstand. A small thing. He observed it and placed it in the structure he was building, the one that did not yet have a name. In June, he drove past the building where Adrienne's firm had its offices and saw her standing in the parking lot with a man he did not recognize. Tall, a lifted Ram 1500 behind him, a way of holding himself that Caleb read in under 2 seconds as someone who had decided he was the most significant person in any space he occupied. They were standing close. The man put his hand on Adrienne's arm. Caleb drove past at regular speed. He did not slow. He did not stop. He noted the truck's partial plate, the man's approximate height and build, the time, 12:43 p.m., and he drove to his job site. He did not say anything to Adrienne that evening. He cooked dinner. He asked about her day. She said it was fine. He said that was good. He began that week to pay closer attention to the joint account. What he found when he paid closer attention was that the joint account had been losing money in ways that the household budget did not account for, not dramatically. $2,200 in March, $3,100 in April, $4,400 across 2 transactions in May. He pulled the statements back to January and went through them line by line, the way he had once gone through intelligence packages before a mission. Without assumption, without rushing the pattern, letting it show itself. What it showed him, by the time he was done, was 9 months of systematic transfers totaling $67,000, each one timed within 72 hours of his direct deposit, each one routed to an account he did not have visibility on. He sat with this information for 3 days. On the 4th day, he drove to a law office on Hay Street that a buddy from his unit had used in his own divorce 3 years prior. The attorney's name was James Colt, former JAG, 20 years in family law, who had the particular quality of a man who has heard everything and reached the conclusion that almost nothing requires dramatic reaction. He listened to Caleb for 35 minutes without writing anything down. Then he picked up his pen and wrote 4 things. He said, "The transfers are dissipation of marital assets." He said, "I want a forensic accountant on this by the end of the week." He said, "Do not move out of the marital residence under any circumstances, regardless of what she asks." Then he said, "What did you do in the Army exactly?" Caleb told him. Colt looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote a 4th thing, circled it, and said, "Good. If this gets physical before we file, I need to know everything that happens." "Everything," Caleb said, understood. He drove home. He cooked dinner. He went to Tuesday evening wrestling practice and ran the kids through single-leg takedown drills for 90 minutes. He drove home, showered, and sat on the back porch until 11 watching the white oak in the dark. He had spent 8 years in conditions that required him to hold a great deal of information without allowing it to change his outward behavior, because the mission required it, and because the people around him required it, and because he understood, at a level below strategy, that composure is not the absence of feeling, but the decision to remain functional in its presence. He had held the information about Adrienne the same way. Not because he felt nothing, because he knew what feeling nothing leads a person to, and what feeling everything productively also leads to. And the second destination was the only one worth navigating toward. He met James Colt again the following Thursday. Sharon Briggs, the forensic accountant Colt recommended, a woman who had spent 14 years in financial crimes before going private, and who approached personal accounts with the same assumption of intent she had once applied to corporate fraud, had completed a preliminary review. The $67,000 had moved to a personal savings account at a credit union in Spring Lake. The account was held solely in Adrienne's name. Sharon had found, in the 2 most recent months, 2 transactions out of that account, $8,400 to a vendor she was still identifying, and $12,000 to a Venmo account registered to an MWeb. Caleb looked at that last line for a moment. Then, he looked at Colt. Colt said, "We file on Monday." The filing did not happen on Monday. On Saturday morning, 2 days before the scheduled filing, Caleb was in the backyard at 7:15 a.m., fitting a cross beam on the fence structure. The morning was cool and clear. He had the radio on low, a country station he half listened to while he worked. He was 3 beams in, measuring the 4th, when the sound of vehicles in the front of the house reached him through the stillness. 2 vehicles. He could hear it in the way sound distributes differently around corners, the way 2 engines settling into park produce a slightly different ambient signature than one. He set down his tape measure. He walked through the side gate and looked. A lifted black Ram 1500 at the curb. Behind it, a white Silverado. Marcus Webb stood in the driveway in a gray Henley with his arms folded and his jaw set. Behind him, 4 men in work gear, his employees, Caleb gauged, construction workers, physically capable, unaware in the particular way of men who have been brought to something by someone else and have not assessed it themselves. Caleb read all 5 in the time it took them to see him come through the gate. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the 4 men. He looked back at Marcus. Marcus's posture said, "I have done this before, and it has always worked." His positioning said, he has placed the 4 men between himself and the door, which means he plans to talk and let them act. The 4 men's positioning said, they have been told this will be simple. 2 of them had already begun to think about something other than the task. One was checking his phone. The 4th, the largest, standing directly behind Marcus and slightly left, was the only one whose attention was fully in the moment, and his attention, when Caleb met it, shifted in a way that attention shifts when it has encountered something it was not expecting. Caleb stopped 6 feet from Marcus. He said nothing. He put his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and looked at Marcus Webb with the steady, unhurried regard of a man who has made his assessment and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Marcus said, "You know why we're here." Caleb said, "No." Marcus said, "Adrienne wants you out. We're here to help that happen." He said it the way men say things when they have said them before to people who accepted it. Caleb looked at him for 3 seconds. He said, "You're on private property. Trespassing in North Carolina is a criminal matter." He said it without changing his tone, the way he stated facts, because it was one. Marcus's jaw tightened. He said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He made a small motion with his head toward the 4 men behind him. The man on Caleb's left, number 3 in the original assessment, the one whose attention had wandered back to the situation, took half a step forward. Caleb did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Marcus and said, quietly and with complete specificity, "Don't." The man stopped. He stopped in the way that certain things stop when the thing in front of them resolves into clarity. He did not take the second half of the step. The screen door opened. Adrienne came out onto the porch. She had her phone in her hand. She said, "Marcus," I said to Just. She looked at Caleb and stopped. Caleb looked at her. Then he looked back at Marcus. He said, "You have until the count of 10 to get back in your vehicles." He said it at conversational volume, the way he gave instructions on a job site. Not louder, not with edge in it. Just a number and a direction. Marcus said, "You can't." Caleb said, 7. Something in the air of the driveway changed. It changed the way air changes in a room, when the structural thing everyone has been depending on shifts, and the room realizes it. The man behind Marcus, the large one, the only one whose full attention had been present from the beginning, put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and said something close to his ear. Marcus looked at Caleb. He looked at him for a full 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds he performed the assessment he should have performed before he loaded 4 men into a truck and drove to someone else's house on a Saturday morning. He did not finish the count. The 4 men moved back to the Silverado without drama. Marcus stood for one more moment in Caleb's driveway with his arms at his sides and his jaw working at something, and then he walked to the Ram and got in. The Ram pulled from the curb. The Silverado followed. They were gone. Caleb stood in the driveway and listened to the engines until he could not hear them. Then he turned around. Adrienne was on the porch with her phone still in her hand, looking at him with an expression he recognized as the particular look of someone who has just had the picture they have been living inside fail to hold its shape. She said, "Raymond." She stopped. She said, "Caleb." She stopped again. He said, "You should call your attorney." His voice was level. He said, "Mine files Monday." He went back through the side gate. He picked up the tape measure. He finished measuring the 4th cross beam, marked it, and made the cut. The neighbor across the street, a retired sheriff's deputy named Leonard, who had been watching from his porch since the trucks pulled up, called Caleb's number at 9 a.m. He said, "I saw everything that happened in your driveway. If you need a witness, I kept notes." Caleb said, "I appreciate that, Leonard." He did. He said, "I'll let my attorney know." He called James Colt on Monday as planned. Colt filed that afternoon. He also added to the petition a detailed account of Saturday morning, supported by Leonard's written statement, which Colt described in a call to Caleb as establishing an intimidation and coercion pattern that would inform the court's view of the entire proceeding. He said, "The other side made a significant tactical error on Saturday." Caleb said, "I know." Colt said, "They thought they were dealing with someone who could be pushed." Caleb said, "A lot of people have thought that." Colt said, "How does it usually go?" Caleb said, "Not the way they thought." Sharon Briggs completed her full forensic report in 3 weeks. The $67,000 was fully documented. The $12,000 transfer to M. Webb's Venmo account, combined with Leonard's statement, placed Marcus Webb at the center of both the financial manipulation and the attempted coercion. Sharon also found, in a drawer Adrienne had left open on the household computer during one of the weeks Caleb was working away on a job, a document Adrienne had saved titled simply, Plan. It was a 12-point outline of the divorce strategy, including the asset transfer schedule, a property valuation she had estimated at $280,000, and a note at the bottom that read, "He won't know what to fight, because he won't know what he's lost." He had known what he was looking at since February. He simply had not told her. The mediation was held on a Thursday morning in a conference room on Hay Street. Adrienne arrived with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Kane, who was good at her job and had prepared with the information her client had given her, which was not the information the room contained. James Colt had arranged the documents in the order he wanted them read. The forensic accounting report first, then Shuren's supplemental findings on the Venmo transfer, then Leonard's sworn statement about Saturday morning. Caleb sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his jacket on and his field notebook closed in front of him. He looked at Patricia Kane when she looked at him, and he looked at the documents when they were referenced, and once, briefly, he looked at Adrienne. She was looking at the forensic report. She was reading the $67,000 line and the transfer schedule and the note Shuren had made beside the timing pattern, systematic and calibrated, consistent with deliberate concealment. She read it with the particular stillness of a person receiving information they have been moving toward for 9 months, without ever expecting to arrive there. Colt placed Leonard's statement on the table. He described Saturday morning in full, the 2 vehicles, the 5 men, the driveway, the specific language Marcus Webb had used. He said, "We will be requesting the court consider this incident as evidence of a pattern of intimidation and coercion, and we will be naming Marcus Webb in the supplemental filing." Patricia Kane looked at her client. Adrienne was looking at the table. Colt said, "I'd also like to address something my client would like to say directly." Caleb said, "I spent 8 years in Special Forces. 18 Delta, 2 deployments." He said it without emphasis, the way you state a credential when it is relevant. He said, "I was medically retired in 2013. I have been a licensed contractor in North Carolina since 2016. I coach youth wrestling on Tuesday evenings." He said, "None of this was hidden. It was simply never asked about." He looked at Adrienne. "I answered every question you ever asked me. You never asked about the Army past medical." He paused. "I did not hide from you. You did not look." The room was quiet. The ventilation ran behind the walls. He said, 5 men in my driveway." He said it once. He did not say anything more about it. Adrienne's attorney called a recess. What followed, when the recess ended, was not a negotiation in the way Adrienne had planned a negotiation. It was a recalibration. Patricia Kane was a skilled attorney, and she worked with what she had, which was considerably less than she had walked in expecting to work with. The joint account transfers were credited back against Adrienne's share of the marital estate. The coercion finding, supported by Leonard's statement, informed the court's equitable distribution posture in a direction that did not favor the party who had sent 5 men to a driveway on a Saturday morning. The house remained Caleb's. The business, Mercer Build LLC, formed before the marriage on capital Caleb had saved in the Army and built over 4 years without Adrienne's involvement in any operational capacity, remained Caleb's. He signed at 12:18 p.m. He shook Colt's hand. He picked up his field notebook and his jacket. He walked to the elevator without looking back at the conference room. He drove home in the F-250. The cracked side mirror was still cracked. He had looked at it twice in the past month and decided, both times, that it was not the thing that required his attention first. Marcus Webb did not appear at any point in the legal proceedings in a capacity that benefited him. The supplemental filing, which named him in the coercion allegation, and documented the $12,000 Venmo transfer as a co-mingled financial relationship with Adrienne during the period of asset dissipation, reached his attorney 2 weeks after mediation. His attorney's response was measured in a way that strongly suggested Marcus had also consulted privately with someone who had explained what the driveway incident looked like. from a legal exposure standpoint. He did not contest the findings. He and Adrienne had spoken less frequently since Saturday morning, in a pattern Caleb noted without particular interest. By November, the pattern had resolved in the way that patterns resolve when the financial premise they were built on has been corrected. Adrienne moved into an apartment in Fayetteville in October. She continued her work at the firm. She was good at her work, and the work did not change because the rest of her life had. She went to her desk every morning, and she was professional and capable, and she did not speak about any of it to her colleagues, because she was not the kind of person who needed other people to hold her story for her. She thought about Saturday morning more than she expected to. She thought about the driveway and the 5 men and Caleb coming through the side gate in his canvas jacket with his hands in his pockets, and the way the morning had shifted when he looked at Marcus and said nothing, and the way Marcus's face had looked in the 3 seconds before he walked back to the truck. She had spent 11 years next to a man and had assembled a picture of him from what she could see at the surface and had never looked past it, and what she had not looked past was everything. His stillness that she had read as passivity was not passivity. His silence that she had read as smallness was not smallness. She had called him soft to a man who did not know him, and the man she had called soft had counted down from 7 in his own driveway and not moved a single inch, and 5 men had left. She had not known him, not the real shape of him. She had known the picture she had made, and she had lived inside it for 11 years and planned around it, and in the end had gambled everything on it, and the picture had not been real. He was never soft. She had just never looked hard enough to find the edges. Caleb finished the fence structure in November, on a cold Saturday with good light. He set the final board, stepped back, checked the level, made one small adjustment at the northeast post, and checked the level again. It was correct. He put the level in his toolbox and stood back and looked at the whole of it. He had designed it himself, measured it himself, cut it himself, built it from the ground up across 3 weekends. It was level and square and built from materials that would hold against weather for 20 years without drama. It was not the kind of thing that announced itself. It was simply correct, and correct in a way that would remain correct long after anyone had stopped thinking about it. He carried his tools in. He made coffee. He sat on the back porch in the cold with the canvas jacket and the thermos and looked at what he had built in the gray November light. His Tuesday wrestling kids had a tournament in 2 weeks. He had been drilling a new approach with the lighter weights, a modified inside trip he had adapted from a technique he had learned in a training environment he did not discuss, which translated cleanly to the youth level if you drilled the entry point correctly, and his kids were getting it. One of them, a small, determined 12-year-old named Dante, who lost every match he competed in for the first 6 months and came to every practice anyway, had hit the entry 3 times clean in a row at the last session. Caleb had said, "That's it. That's exactly it." And Dante had looked at him with the look of someone who has been trying something difficult for a long time and has just felt it work. And that look was the one Caleb was in the business of producing in people. His brother Marcus, not the other Marcus, his actual brother, a man of 36 in Atlanta who called every 2 weeks with the comfortable obligation of brothers who have never needed to perform their closeness, had called the previous Sunday. Caleb told him what had happened, in the abbreviated version that brothers use when they already understand each other's structure. Marcus said, "You good?" Caleb said, "Yeah." Marcus said, "You need anything?" Caleb said, "No." Marcus said, "Okay." They talked for another 20 minutes about their mother's new dog, which Marcus found alarming and their mother found delightful, and then they said goodbye, and that was that. Colt had sent a final billing summary and a 1-line note at the bottom, cleanest set of facts I've worked with in 30 years. The documentation. The witness. The tactical decision to not engage physically when it would have been justified. He had underlined that last part. Caleb folded the note and put it in his field notebook. He went inside when the coffee was gone. He rinsed the thermos. He checked tomorrow's job schedule. A foundation pour in Rayford. Early start, crew of 3. Forms already set and inspected. He made the small note in his notebook about the time he needed to leave in the morning and set it on the counter where he kept it. He turned off the kitchen light. He had built the kitchen to last. The floors, the shelving, the countertops, everything in it was level, square, and done correctly the first time, because he did not build things in ways that would require him to come back and fix them. He stood in it for a moment in the dark, the way he sometimes stood in completed work, not admiring it exactly, but recognizing it, checking that it was what it was supposed to be. It was. He went to bed. The alarm was set for 4:40. He would be awake before it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.